Stop right there. ID, now.
I'm just waiting for a ride. Is there a problem?
Don't play games with me. I said ID.
Am I being detained, or is this just harassment?
Step over here. Don't argue.
The security camera didn't catch sound, only posture. A uniformed officer squared his shoulders under fluorescent lights, hand drifting toward his belt, as if muscle memory alone could win the moment. Across from him stood a man in plain clothes, calm, eyes tired from a 12-hour shift inside the trauma wing. The parking lot smelled of antiseptic and rain. What followed wasn't loud. It was worse. It was quiet authority colliding with prejudice, and the quiet was recorded. Stories like this don't unfold in headlines, they unravel in seconds. If you want to understand how power fractures, how careers end without a single shot fired, and why accountability often begins in silence, stay with this story. Watch closely. The hospital never really slept. Even at 1:47 a.m., the lights in the emergency wing burned white and constant, bleaching the color out of everything they touched. Ambulances came and went in slow intervals, tires hissing on damp asphalt, leaving behind the faint smell of diesel and disinfectant. Somewhere inside, a trauma team worked on a body that had arrived too late. Somewhere else, a nurse cried quietly in a supply room. Outside, in the employee parking lot, a different kind of pressure was building, one that had nothing to do with medicine. The officer paced near the curb line, boots scraping small arcs in the grit. His patrol car sat angled toward the exit, engine idling, dash lights dark but alive. He had been dispatched for a suspicious person report. Hospital security unsure about a man lingering near staff vehicles. It was routine, the kind of call officers cleared in minutes. But routine had a way of changing when assumptions took the lead. He spotted the man by the third row of parked cars. Plain clothes, dark jacket, phone in hand. Calm posture. Too calm, the officer thought. The training manual never said that out loud, but the instinct was there. Calm could mean defiant, detached could mean hiding something. The officer adjusted his vest and walked over, radio crackling softly at his shoulder. "Sir," he said, voice clipped, professional. "Hospital security asked me to check on you. I need to see some identification." The man looked up slowly. His face carried the tired neutrality of someone who had spent the day making decisions that mattered. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. He simply met the officer's eyes. "I'm waiting for my ride," he said. Even tone, measured. "What's the issue?" The officer felt it then, that subtle resistance that wasn't resistance at all, a question where compliance should have been. He shifted his weight, thumb brushing the edge of his duty belt. Policy floated in his mind. Half remembered. Consensual encounter, reasonable suspicion, detention. The lines mattered, but only if you respected them. "I asked for ID," the officer said again, slower this time. "You're being uncooperative." The man exhaled, a quiet breath that carried more patience than the moment deserved. "Am I being detained?" he asked. It was a simple question, legally precise. The kind taught in police academies usually as a hypothetical. The officer heard it as a challenge. His jaw tightened. Around them, the lot hummed, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a gurney rolling past the glass doors inside. The distant chirp of a heart monitor leaking through the walls. "Step over here," the officer said, gesturing toward the patrol car. His hand lingered too close to his holster, not drawing, not yet, but close enough to change the temperature of the air. The man didn't move. He raised his hands slightly, palms visible, a gesture that was both compliant and deliberate. "Officer," he said, "I haven't committed a crime. I'm on hospital property with permission." The officer scoffed. "You don't get to decide that." What he didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to ask, was that the man had just come off a 12-hour shift, overseeing a multi-agency task force briefing inside that same building. That the hospital badge, clipped to his belt, partially obscured by his jacket, carried a rank that outranked the officer by several levels. Authority worn lightly looks invisible to those who expect it to announce itself. A security guard paused near the entrance, watching. Two nurses slowed their steps, eyes flicking between the men. The officer felt the audience and mistook it for validation. He took a half step closer, voice dropping. "Last chance," he said. "ID. Now." The man's gaze didn't waver. There was no anger in it, just a quiet calculation. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. Mistakes, in policing, often happen in seconds. This one unfolded under steady light, recorded by a camera mounted high on a concrete pillar, its red indicator blinking patiently. The officer reached for his cuffs, not yet snapping them closed, just holding them, metal glinting. In that moment, The parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Between life and death, between authority and accountability, a line was being tested, and once crossed, it would not be invisible again. The cuffs stayed in the officer's hand, loose but present, like punctuation waiting to end a sentence. He didn't put them away. He didn't advance either. He stood there, squared up beneath the lights, certain that control was something you asserted, not something you earned. The man in plain clothes noticed the detail immediately. He had spent years reading rooms like this: conference tables, briefing halls, interrogation suites. Power always revealed itself in small movements, a tightened grip, a breath held too long. He kept his hands visible, fingers relaxed, and took a half step back, creating space that felt intentional. "Officer," he said, calm but firmer now, "I'm asking you to slow this down." The words weren't a command. They were an invitation, one the officer didn't recognize. "Don't tell me how to do my job," the officer replied. His voice carried the brittle edge of pride. "You fit the description," security called. "That's enough." The man nodded once, absorbing the logic without accepting it. "What description?" he asked. Silence, just long enough to be noticeable. The officer glanced toward the entrance where the security guard stood, suddenly very busy with a radio that wasn't speaking. Somewhere behind the glass, a code alarm chimed and was quickly silenced. Life went on inside. Outside, the encounter narrowed. "I'm requesting your supervisor," the man said. That did it. The officer laughed, short and humorless. "You don't get to request anything," he said, lifting his radio. "Dispatch, start me a unit. Possible obstruction." The timestamp would matter later, 1:49 a.m., because policy did. According to department guidelines, a supervisor request during a consensual encounter was not grounds for escalation, but the officer didn't frame this as consensual anymore. He reframed it as defiance. Bias had a way of doing that, turning neutrality into threat. "Before you do that," the man said quietly, "I'm going to ask you again, am I being detained?" The officer hesitated. "Not long, just enough for the camera to catch it." "You are now," he said. "On what basis?" "Failure to identify." The man's eyes flicked, just once, to the officer's chest camera, the red light blinking. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not louder, but clearer. "Your department policy requires reasonable suspicion of a crime," he said. "Waiting for a ride isn't one." The officer stiffened. Training, half-remembered, surfaced like an accusation. He stepped closer to reassert distance, an old contradiction. "You sound real familiar with policy," he said. "I am," the man replied. It wasn't bravado, it was fact. And facts, when ignored, tend to circle back with force. The officer keyed his radio again. "Dispatch, run a check on hospital cameras. I got a subject refusing to comply." "Copy," came the response, flat and recorded. "Stand by." The word subject landed hard. The nurses by the door exchanged a look. They'd seen this before, not this exactly, but close enough. A moment where something routine slipped its leash. "Officer," the man said, and now there was steel beneath the calm. "I'm telling you plainly, you're escalating without cause." The officer shook his head, smiling thinly. "You don't get to lecture me. Rank, when unseen, often reveals itself through restraint." The man could have ended it right then, could have said the words, produced the badge, shattered the illusion. He chose not to, not yet. Because he wanted the process to speak for itself. Because he knew that how an officer behaves before knowing who you are matters more than what he does after. A second patrol car rolled into the lot, headlights washing over the scene. Back up. The officer's shoulders eased, just a fraction. Reinforcement felt like confirmation. The man glanced at the arriving unit, then back at the officer. "This doesn't end the way you think it does," he said. Under the fluorescent lights, with cameras watching and witnesses gathering, the officer tightened, his grip on the cuffs, still not closing them, still hovering on the edge of a decision. Authority was about to introduce itself. A second patrol car settled into place with a low, mechanical sigh, engine idling, headlights cutting long shadows across the parked vehicles. The backup officer stepped out slowly, eyes moving before his feet did. He took in the scene the way experienced cops learn to distance between bodies, hands, tone. He didn't speak at first. Silence, in moments like this, was information. "You good?" he asked the first officer quietly. "Yeah," came the answer, too fast. "Guy won't ID, detaining him." The words detaining him landed with more weight than the officer seemed to realize. They crossed a threshold, legal, procedural, moral. From this point on, everything would be reviewed through that lens. The cuffs were no longer hypothetical. The man in plain clothes shifted his stance, angling his body slightly away, hand still open. His voice stayed level, but something had changed. Patience had hardened into record. For clarity, he said, looking between both officers now, I am not resisting. I am not obstructing. I am asserting my rights. The backup officer frowned, eyes narrowing just enough to register doubt. What's the call? He asked. Suspicious person, the first officer said. Security request. The backup officer glanced toward the hospital entrance. The security guard looked away. That, too, would matter later. Suspicious how? The backup asked. The first officer hesitated, just a beat. Loitering. At a hospital, the man said quietly. At 2 a.m. The absurdity hung there, unspoken but loud. Ambulances didn't schedule themselves. Trauma didn't punch a clock. Turn around, the first officer ordered. The command was sharp now, stripped of pretense. Procedure had become performance. The man didn't comply immediately. Not out of defiance, but because timing mattered. He wanted the camera to see what came next. Officer, he said, you are ordering a custodial detention without articulable suspicion. That's a violation of turn. Around. The officer stepped forward, closing the distance. Cuffs raised. The backup officer stiffened, hand drifting not to his weapon, but to the radio clipped at his shoulder. A line was being crossed, and everyone felt it. The man turned, slowly, deliberately. Not the jerky movement of resistance, but the controlled compliance of someone documenting every second with his body. As the officer reached for his wrist, the man spoke again. Before you do this, he said, you should know who you're putting in cuffs. The officer didn't pause. His hand closed around the man's arm. The grip was firm, unnecessary. A show, save it, the officer said. Metal clicked. One cuff closed not tight, but not loose enough to pretend restraint wasn't happening. That sound brief. Final would echo later in hearing rooms and court filings. That's enough, the backup officer said, stepping closer now. Hold up. The first officer ignored him, pulling the man's other arm back. Stop interfering, he snapped. I'm not interfering, the backup replied, voice tense. I'm advising. The man turned his head just enough to look at the camera mounted above the lot. Then he spoke, clearly, carefully. My name is Lieutenant Daniel Reyes, he said. Badge number available upon request. I am assigned to Internal Investigations, Metro Division. The words didn't explode. They sank. The officer froze. For a half second, nobody moved. Not the nurses watching from the doorway. Not the security guard. Not even the wind. The backup officer's eyes widened. His hand dropped from the radio. Lieutenant, he said. The first officer's grip loosened involuntarily. Color drained from his face, in stages confusion first, then disbelief, then something closer to fear. That doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice betrayed him. It wavered. Authority, once borrowed from assumption, had just been revoked. Reyes stayed still. It changes everything, he said softly. The camera blinked red. Procedure had been violated. Policy had been ignored, and now, the system had been forced to look at itself up close, in unforgiving light. Nothing about this could be undone. The cuffs came off without ceremony. No apology, no acknowledgement, just metal loosening, wrists freed, the sound oddly loud in the sudden quiet. The first officer stepped back, as if distance alone could rewind the last 3 minutes. The backup officer cleared his throat, eyes fixed anywhere but the lieutenant's face. Lieutenant, I didn't, the first officer began. Reyes lifted a hand, not to stop him, to contain the moment. We're done talking out here, he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Call your supervisor. This time, the radio came up, without argument. The supervisor arrived at 2:07 a.m., lights washing the lot in rotating blue. He took in the scene fast, too fast for comfort. Plainclothes lieutenant, 2 patrol units, hospital staff lingering, cameras everywhere. His shoulders sagged just slightly. He knew what this was already becoming. Lieutenant Reyes, he said, nodding once. I'll handle this. Reyes nodded back. No satisfaction, no triumph, just fatigue. I'm sure you will. By policy, the officers were separated. Statements delayed. Cameras secured. The supervisor advised a first officer of his rights under departmental procedure, administrative, not criminal. That distinction mattered. It always did. The words were rehearsed, delivered the way they always were after something went wrong. Inside the hospital, an incident report was already being drafted. Time, location, involved personnel. The nurses would submit statements before their shift ended. Security would upload footage from the parking lot cameras. The system moved quietly now, efficiently, like it always did once the adrenaline drained. 2 days later, in a windowless room at headquarters, the footage began to play. No commentary, no narration, just sound and motion. The first clip came from the officer's body camera. His voice sounded different in playback, hotter, sharper. Commands landed without context. The pause before declaring detention stretched uncomfortably long. Reviewers noted the hand placement near the holster, the moment the cuffs appeared, the lack of articulated suspicion. Each timestamp was logged, each deviation flagged. Then the parking lot camera angle. No audio, but clear truth. Distance closed unnecessarily. A step forward answered with a step back. Hands raised. Compliance without submission. The click of the cuff, visible even without sound. In internal affairs, no one spoke while the footage ran. They didn't need to. Policy manuals lay open on the table. Pages marked with tabs: detention standards, bias indicators, escalation protocols on medical campuses. Training dates were cross-referenced. The officer had completed implicit bias training 8 months earlier. The acknowledgement signature was there. Reyes watched his own footage later alone. He didn't linger on the cuff. He watched the officer's face, how certainty curdled into confusion, how authority faltered when confronted with accountability. It wasn't personal. That was the point. It never was. The officer's statement arrived last. It leaned heavily on perception, on gut feeling, on safety concerns that hadn't been verbalized in the moment. The language was defensive, circular. It contradicted the video in small ways that added up. Public Affairs drafted a holding statement. An incident involving an officer and a member of the public is under review. No names, no conclusions. Silence stretched for 48 hours. Then broke when the footage leaked, first a clip, then the whole sequence. Comment sections ignited, but the department didn't look there. It looked inward. At policy. At liability. At credibility. The chief reviewed the file himself. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. The cameras had already answered them. In the end, discipline isn't decided by outrage. It's decided by evidence. And the evidence spoke clearly. The termination letter was 4 pages long, single-spaced, heavy with citations. It arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning, the envelope thicker than it needed to be, as if weight alone could communicate finality. The officer sat at his kitchen table and read it twice. The language was clinical. Violation of detention policy. Failure to articulate reasonable suspicion. Unjustified escalation. Conduct unbecoming. Each finding referenced a timestamp, a frame of video, a line from training he had once initialed without reading closely. There was no mention of racism, not explicitly. Departments rarely wrote that word. Instead, it appeared indirectly in phrases like biased decision-making indicators and disparate treatment absent lawful basis. The meaning was clear enough. His career ended not with sirens or handcuffs, but with documentation. He appealed. Of course he did. Union counsel argued stress, ambiguity, officer safety. The appeal hearing lasted 40 minutes. The video lasted 7. The decision was upheld. Across town, Lieutenant Daniel Reyes returned to work the same way he always had, quietly. No press conference, no interview requests accepted. His supervisors asked if he wanted time off. He declined. Accountability, he believed, mattered more when it looked ordinary. He sat through briefings, reviewed files, signed off on cases involving officers he had never met. Some avoided his eyes, others didn't. Both reactions told him something. Policy changes followed, not loudly but deliberately. The department issued a directive clarifying detention standards on hospital and university campuses. Supervisors were required to respond immediately to rank unknown confrontations. Bodycam review protocols were updated to flag early escalation markers, hand placement, command repetition without cause. Bias training, once annual and forgettable, became scenario-based, mandatory, documented with follow-ups. None of it felt like victory. It felt like maintenance. The hospital parking lot went back to being what it was before, a place of comings and goings, of exhaustion and relief. The camera remained mounted to the concrete pillar, blinking patiently, indifferent to intention. Most nights, nothing happened there worth reviewing. That was the goal. Reyes visited the lot once more, weeks later, after another late shift. Rain fell lightly, rinsing oil from the asphalt, reflections stretching the lights into long, trembling lines. He stood where the cuffs had closed and turned and walked away. There was no sense of triumph in it, only a quiet resolve. Justice, when it works, doesn't feel like celebration. It feels like correction, like something heavy being set back into place. The officer found work outside law enforcement. Different uniform, fewer cameras. He told people the system had turned on him. Sometimes they believed him. Sometimes they didn't. The truth lived on servers and in policy binders unchanged by opinion. In the end, the incident didn't end prejudice. It didn't fix policing. It did something smaller and more important. It proved that authority without restraint leaves a record, and that sometimes that record is enough to force a system to look at itself and choose deliberately to do better. The lot hummed. The lights stayed on. And the silence, this time, meant accountability had already spoken.